The Murder of Wiggy Wheaton by Chris Wade. This story starts with a bang. Well, not literally a bang, but very dramatically. I was faced with an awful dilemma on the particular morning I speak of. As I do on one out of every 3 days or thereabouts, I needed to nip to the post office. No big deal, you say. Aha! But this was the windiest day of the year so far, even windier than last year's windiest day, which was a very windy day indeed. Windy days are a nightmare for a man with wispy hair, which, like many poor unfortunate men, I have found myself cursed with. It's surely not fair for a man as young and modestly handsome as I am to have the hair consistency of a Dickensian miser, hunched, crooked-backed on some blustery day, cloak covering face, overlong strands flying around like greasy seaweed. The morning comb-over ritual, a daily routine performed with such precision and concentration that it's almost painful for me, becomes more and more drawn out and tasking week after week as the hair gets thinner, the wisps more wispy, or indeed wispier, to use the correct word. The maximum hold hairspray is okay, perfect for the thinning gentleman, but you have to apply the exact amount needed, otherwise it can all become a nightmare. Spray too much on and it flattens the hair and makes the comb-over segments look more obvious, streaking out across your head like really rubbish cobwebs. Holding the pocket mirror over the balding spot so you can peer at it through the bathroom mirror with your poor pathetic pissy eyes under those harsh 100-watt bulbs only makes the whole thing more degrading and torturous. Still, it's worth it in the end. That is, of course, if a successful combing over is achieved. If not, you need to re-drench the head under the cold tap, thus risking hypothermia, towel dry it with speedy, frustrated vigour, reapply the expensive Swedish thickening solution Man-Thick, and start again, reaching for the hairspray, a solemn expression on the face, similar to a suicidal man reaching for his pills. So, I got one of those little cards through, you know the ones, they post them through the letterbox when they try to deliver something between the hours of any time now and the next 4 millenniums, so make sure you stay indoors, you pathetic no-life Burke, and wait by the letterbox with your mouth open like an obedient hound. And of course they arrive just at the exact moment I happen to go for a poo. It's addressed to Clint Gareth on the card, another case of the authorities misspelling my surname once again. It's Clint Garth, for God's sake. Is that such a strange name, really? I spent 2 hours on intense window watch, waiting for the wind to calm down a little, before building up the courage to head out there into that whirlwind of doom and potential shame. I saw old women being thrown viciously aside by the merciless gales, roughly banging into brick walls, false teeth falling out and clattering into bits on the pavement. Their shopping bags going airborne, fruit and veg covering the pavement like healthy litter. I saw a rogue tin of beans smacking a passer-by in the face, blood floating off into the gale like some weird red ghost. It was madness, total chaos. The post office, just within sight over the horizon, was over 130 metres away from my house, and the wind on that day was blowing approximately 60 miles per hour, heading due north. So if I ran there at just the right angle and speed, I was sure to prevent any serious comb-over blowage. I mean, as it happens, the wind was manageable when I did get outside. Thankfully, it had calmed down a tiny bit. But if the wind ever did become particularly savage and unworkable, I just popped a hat on. It wasn't the best option, though, as when I removed the hat upon my return home, the comb-over was ruined. All the hard work performed in vain, and I had to reach out for Man-Thick with extreme glumness and start all over again. All this meant nothing on that hellish day, though. It was trivial compared to what I would later come across and inadvertently get myself involved in. I made my way through the harsh wind, feeling like an army bloke sprinting through a war zone. Thankfully, my estimations on wind speed and direction were spot on, and I made it to the postie in good time. Going through the doors, I was greeted by Swinty Lagoon, a large man who worked behind the counter, his face lit up like a big, chuffed light bulb. "Clint," he said, holding his arms out as if he wanted a cuddle from me, which was actually impossible, seeing as he was standing behind that massive bulletproof glass partition that separates the general public from the honoured godly few employed by the post office. Unless we had really thin arms, thin enough to get through the little air holes in the glass, then a cuddle of any kind, be it a light, manly, back-patting hug or a warm, intimate, highly inappropriate embrace, was totally out of the question.
"How's the wife and kids, Clint?"
he asked, his warm northern tone booming outwards from his man mouth. "I'm not married, Swinty," I replied, looking round me with slight unease. I was always conscious of the comb-over when in a queue, hoping that it wasn't hilariously obvious to anyone who might join the queue behind me or walk past to get to the mints and heavy-duty bin liners.
"Don't worry, lad, you will be one day," he smiled,
looking at me through both the glasses on his face and the partition between us as if I was some poor, sad penny-mouth. He need not have pitied me, though, the old git, because I like being all alone with no hope of happiness or even the slightest possibility of a bright and wonderful family life ahead, residing in some lovely country cottage with children and pets crawling round at my knees as I stand guffawing in a flowery shirt, with my wife holding on to me and gazing at me in near worship, before heading into my autumn years with grandkids and great-grandkids sitting on my knee and swinging off my arms, eventually meeting my Maker in a lovely cosy bed with 3 generations of my kin gathered round, handing me gifts with loving smiles on their faces, and me giving them all a last word of advice before I close my eyes and drift away. I wasn't bothered about any of that stuff, and in no way did I have it all mapped out longingly in my head.
"And children you shall have, young man. Lots and lots of children," he continued, his voice becoming slightly theatrical and show-busy. The effeminate wristbands he wore rattled about musically and glittered in the sun.
"I'm not that bothered really, Swifty, honest," I insisted, lying to myself as I stood there peering in the shoplifting mirror oh so slyly to make sure my hair hadn't gone all odd in the wind and I hadn't been walking round looking like a freak.
"Well, I have sound advice for all couples wishing to mate and reproduce," he began, pushing his specs up on his nose, one hand on his hip to appear like some casually wise urban oracle of sex. "I'm one of 12 myself, and I went on to have 7 children of my own. I eventually had to have a vasectomy, but of course it didn't work because I'm such a powerful lover. And I went on to have 3 more kids after that. Got 14 grandkids too. I not only have to glance at people and they're pregnant. Virile isn't the word, son. Couples come to me from all over England seeking my advice about starting a family. They come up saying, we've tried this, we tried that, we've tried it at this angle, at that angle. The doctors told us to stand on our heads on the night of a full moon and all this codswallop. Well, I give 'em Swifty Lagoon's advice. Words which have gone into legend, folklore, been engraved into the stone of time. These words open the first chapter of my international bestseller, a definitive guide to reproduction, yet to be published, but I'm so sure it'll be a hit. I already announced it as a bestseller. Are you ready for this?
He leaned closer to the glass so that I could smell his breath through the holes. It smelt like toffos. Go on, I whispered, intimidated by his pervy, piercing eyes, which were magnified ridiculously behind his thick-rimmed glasses.
Take her out to pictures. Go see a pervy film if you have to. Come back, have fish, chips and mushy peas and have it off in front of the fire. Mark my words, Clint. You'll be buying baby clobber and a pushchair by the end of bloody week.
I'll bear that in mind, Swinty. Thanks, mate, I said, handing him the slip to retrieve my package, one eye shiftily on the door. When I finally left the admittedly well central-heated warmth of the post office after listening to at least 5 more minutes of Swinty Lagoon's love-making tips, I discovered that the wind had stopped, not just eased a bit or calmed down, but it had actually ceased altogether. It was strange, really strange indeed, and adding to that was this eerie, almost unreal silence, as if the whole town had been put on mute by some massive remote control. And I mean a massive remote control, like really big, so big that you'd have to jump on the buttons to change the channel, like properly jump on it with both... Sorry, I'm going on now about some massive remote control. Anyway, mark my words, it was really quiet. There was no one else around on the streets at all. It was like everyone had vanished or been sucked up into the sky, where they were floating out of sight and earshot of me. As I made my way homeward, package under my arm, I looked around shiftily, feeling like I was being watched with great intensity from all around me. Every footstep echoed across the road like the thud of a wooden leg being smacked on the steel wall of an old rubber factory or something like that, and every crinkling squeak of the leather on my shoes sounded like the earth beneath me splitting wide open. And those shoes are made from the finest Italian leather, I may add. I purchase only the finest shoes I can find. Well, actually, I'm just lying to myself here. I got them from Tradex in the late 90s. Still in good nick, though. Anyway, the moment I reach the end of the post office will remain with and haunt me forever. For the rest of my days, right until I part this Look, it'll stay with me for ages, okay? Donkey's years, actually. There, on the ground, lying on his back, was the body of Wiggy Wheaton, the weatherman for the local news station. His lifeless eyes were like two cracked marbles staring blankly up to the clouds, his body limp but his hands together in fists as if he wanted to take on the bastard who had snatched his life from him so crudely. Most chilling of all, though, was the fact that Wiggy Wheaton appeared to have been killed by his own wig. How, you ask? Well, some bounder had shoved it down his throat and he'd choked to death on it. I shook my head, the irony of his untimely yet slightly amusing demise making itself instantly apparent to me. If he'd been honest with himself and stayed true to the Baldy Brigade, his comb-over comrades, then he would not have died. The very thing that killed him was his own vanity, that glaringly obvious nylon wig of his. We all knew it was a wig, for God's sake. You only had to switch on the 6 o'clock weather report and there it was. That grotesque creation sprawled across his head like a wounded ferret, almost completely see-through under the harsh studio lights. Looked like a pile of dead moths that he just plonked on his head carelessly, hoping no one would notice. Oh, sweet Wiggy Wheaton. If only you hadn't betrayed the slaphead sect, you may still be alive today. As I stared down at the horrifying yet also ridiculous body on the ground, an old woman appeared by my side, and when she caught sight of Wheaton's corpse, she let out a horrified squawk and dived back in the air, like some mad old senile hawk set on rewind. She thudded against the wall hard, shrieking and shaking like a demonic cow. I had to slap her to calm her down. "Calm down, love," I said with frantic upset, but she was hysterical, her tongue wagging about everywhere, spouting out nonsense and speaking in some weird half-Swedish, half-backwards language that only hysterical people seem to understand. Eventually she calmed down and the babbling ceased. "Now, go into the post office and tell Swinty to ring the police," I ordered, acting the responsible one here. "Aye, aye, Corporal," she speedily replied, rather oddly in a man's voice. She was so delirious with what she'd just seen that she imagined I was her superior on a 1940s submarine, or so it sounded from the urgency in her tone. As the old girl dashed inside, I was left alone again with the corpse for a second, stonily silent moment. Poor old Wiggy the weatherman, eh? Saddened by the roadkill-esque animal-like state of him, I couldn't stop staring at him. It was while looking him up and down in pity that I noticed something sticking out of his back pocket. What was the thing which glistened in the afternoon light? I bent down to take a closer look. It was something made of brass. Looking around like a twitchy oddball to ensure my coast was clear, I reached out and calmly took the object from his back pocket. When I heard voices from behind me, I speedily put it in my inside coat pocket for later inspection, a pocket made for these kind of situations, and turned around as if nothing had happened. There stood Swinty Lagoon and the old girl. With a gasp, Swinty took off his specs and leaned over to inspect the body. "Oh shit, it's Wiggy Wheaton, the weatherman," he boomed, wiping a single tear from his eye. "That's gutting, that is, absolutely gutting. Me and the wife are going away to the coast this weekend. We were dying to know what the weather was going to be like.
No one'll never know.
I turned and scowled at Swinty, who clearly knew he was being disrespectful to a man who was both a local pillar of the community and private joke among the townfolk due to his dodgy toupee. Swinty cleared his throat nervously, realising his lack of sensitivity in this situation.
And, oh yeah, gutting, the poor bloke's dead. Ah, poor old Wiggy Wheaton.
As the police sirens wailed out across the street and grew nearer by the second, I clutched the brass object on the inside of my coat firmly. I myself was going to get to the bottom of this. Why me, you ask? Well, because the police in Smoochieville are absolutely useless, and I knew that there was no way they would solve this murder. Well, that and because I'm a really nosy bastard. Back in the safety of my flat, I stood by the window, watching the increasingly chaotic scene as reporters arrived, police vans lined up, and stunned people gawped and gasped in unison. In the background, I had the telly on to keep me up to date with all the goings-on. The newsreader read out the tragedy with a hint of urgency in her voice. "Some really crap news now for you viewers," she began, reading off her card. "Local celeb Walter Wheaton, the local weatherman, who we all know and adore, has been found dead in the town, outside Swinty Lagoon's post office. The true details are not known yet, but it is rumoured that he was killed with his own wig. The news that Walter wore a wig will come as a surprise to many viewers, as Mr. Wheaton's hair was so thick and natural-looking. Of course, the news of his hideously undignified and graphic murder will come as much more of a surprise. Stay tuned for more updates on this tragic story." Hiding round the side of the window frame, out of view of any nosy sods who may have been spying on me spying on them, I reached into my inside coat pocket and pulled out the object I had stolen. Well, not stolen, that makes me sound horrible. The object I'd taken with good intention from the victim's personage. There it was, a brass spatula, fine-looking thing, glinting in the light like a trophy. But who'd want a brass spatula? And why would you carry it in your pocket when you were just pissing about in the street? I was sure to get the answers to these questions. That afternoon I went down to the local pub, the Mature Lobster, and had a pint of Cosmic Dad, one of the house ales, just to think about things. I held the brass spatula close to me, studying it as I sat alone at the bar. The barman cleaned glasses speedily, with a whiter-than-white towel, good conditioner I suspected, and I could see his eyes slyly having a look at the spatula, wondering what's all that about then. I put it back in my pocket and coughed like a nervous penny-mouth. Just at the perfect moment, my good mate Kirby Overblow entered the pub, the doors swinging open wide upon his arrival. It was a bit like that 80s show Cheers, all this, in the way that it was a load of blokes sat in a pub. Unlike Cheers, however, there was no Ted Danson in sight, nor Kirstie Alley, who herself had replaced earlier female lead Shelley Long. And whenever anyone came in through the doors, regulars didn't shout out their name in that lovely, friendly, warm manner like they did in Cheers. There was none of that. In the Mature Lobster, they just turned round as the doors squeaked and either grunted or spat at your shoe. A sea of groans mumbled across the pub as Kirby strutted in, like a misguided BG towards me at the bar, the tail of his long, tossy trench coat dragging behind him like dead rodents on the back of some yokel's rusty wagon. "All right, Clint," he said out of the side of his mouth, as if speaking like that made him look cool, rather than the wank chops, which is what it actually made him look like. "How's it hanging?" "Oh, not bad," I said, sipping some beer. He nodded to the barman and took a seat beside me. "I'll have what he's having, barman," he said, putting on a cool voice. "Why are you doing that voice, Kirby? You sound like an arsehole," I said, rather cruelly, I know. "It's the new me," he drawled, scanning the room with a lazy eye, trying to be like Robert Mitchum or some lad. "Where are all the girls at?" "Girls never come here, Kirby," I said. "You know that. Now drop the stupid voice. I need to talk to you about something." "Oh, aye," he said.
taking his freshly poured drink off the bar. What's that then? Not here, I whispered, speaking muffled behind my glass. Let's go to a booth. A booth? We never go to a booth. What's happening? Something wrong? Are you poorly, lad? You got things on your mind? Oh, I know. Have you decided you fancy me and want to set up home with me? Is that what it is? Are you asking me to share your life with you? No, I snapped. Of course not. Why? Why would you have said that? There was an awkward silence. He looked to the ground and started messing with his sleeve like a daft lad. Well, I'd have said no, obviously. He chuckled nervously and began to speak like an East End mobster. Goes without saying, done it, you fucking muppet. Oi, oi, oggy, oggy and all that. Have it, you mug. We took a corner booth and sat opposite each other. I scanned the room, making sure no one was listening. They weren't. They were too busy getting sloshed. Kirby, you've lived in this town all your life, right? I asked him knowingly. That I have, he grinned. You know the place like the back of your hand. That I do, he replied. Well, with that said, what the hell is this? Just as I said the word this, I dramatically pulled out the brass spatula and held it before his eyes. I don't know, he sharply said. I can't see it, it's too close to my face. I pulled it back and watched his cheeks drain of colour and his eyes glaze over. For 10 or so seconds he looked completely out of it, totally dazed, like he'd lost the flaming plot. So shocked, in fact, that for 1 second he claimed to see a Chinese version of Liberace bashing out a tune in the corner on the old pub piano. I slapped him round the face to stop all this nonsense. Now wasn't a time for ludicrous hallucinations. You know what this is, Kirby? I do, he muttered, pulling himself back from passing out completely. What is it? I asked in desperation. Then I grabbed him by his collar and yanked him about in frustration, rather foolishly actually, and only drawing more attention to myself. Tell me, will you, man? Stop pissing about. My completely unreasonable manner was only making me look like a tosser in front of the other drinkers, who rolled their eyes and groaned at me, thankfully dismissing my angry outburst as the somewhat eccentric behaviour of a harmless yet creepy oddball. After a few seconds, they all turned back to their pints and brushed me aside as a local weirdo. It's the brass spatula, he finally said, his voice wounded and shell-shocked. I know it's a brass spatula, Kirby, but what's it all about? Stop being an impatient shit-buttock and let me tell you, he said, moving in closer across the table. His breath smelt of wheat germ and bleach, but I was too focused on the upcoming revelation to tell him that he really needed a mint. I'd wait till after. He really did need to sort that out, though. When you've lived in Smoochieville as long as I have, you learn a few things. I have lived in Smoochieville as long as you had, I offered, being admittedly unhelpful and a bit of a cock, to be honest. Yeah, you may have lived here as long as me, but you haven't really lived here. He raised his eyebrows and tapped his nose. It's fair to say that I've lived a few lives in Smoochieville. Seen a lot of the underbelly of this town. I've climbed into bed with many women, Clint. Many women, indeed. Sometimes a few at a time. Just get to the spatula bit, would you, Kirby? I impatiently demanded. Anyone who knows this place properly, he began, knows all about the Brass Spatula Society. The whole town is secretly run and controlled by this murky organisation I speak of. Now, even just talking about it could get me killed. If they heard me gabbing on about it to you, they'd probably string me upside down to the ceiling by my widgie and throw porridge oats all over my naked body, them getting stuck in my belly button and matting my chest hair. Or worse still, they might even kill me. They're that serious. I mean, look at the mess they made of Wiggy Wheaton. You think they killed him? I whispered. Oh yeah, of course, that's obviously their work. A classic example of the Brass Spatula's slayings, that is. They use irony and humour in their murders. It's so clear that they're behind it all, and judging by the fact that Wheaton carried a brass spatula in his back pocket suggests pretty blatantly that he too was a member of that oh-so-secret society. But why would they want to kill him? I asked. Oh, well, that's the mystery, my friend. He stopped to take a sip from his beer. That's where we're going to have a bit of trouble. You see, The police won't go near this case. They'll pretend to. Oh yeah, no doubt about that. They'll show the public that they're getting their hands dirty and really digging deep into this grisly case. But in reality, they'll stay well away. Probably close the case within the month, I bet. They're too scared of the Brass Spatula Society. Terrified of them, they are. And rightly so. Even the police are ruled by them. They say the chief superintendent is a member, so there's no way they're going to expose anything about them. If you want to find out who killed Wiggy Wheaton, you're going to have to get to the bottom of it yourself, my lad. I pulled out the spatula and peered down at it as I held it in my hands. What was I getting myself into? Did I really want to risk my life by trying to solve this case? The truth was a resounding yes. That evening I was exhausted, but began trawling the internet for clues about the Brass Spatula Society. It's great, the internet. I kept getting sidetracked. I browsed the full filmography credits of acting legend Robert Duvall and watched a documentary about the potato famine. After getting back to the serious work, though, I regrettably could find nothing online that exposed the seedy underbelly of the town. Nothing at all. And what did I expect? For being so naive and cretinous, I slapped myself hard around the face and called myself several naughty names such as Turd Boy, Burke Lad and Knob Man. I was being ludicrous. It would take more than a quick search on the net to get to the bottom of this shit. The only clue I had that may have led to something was my discovery of a place in the shadier part of town known as Uncle Rusty's, an exclusive drinking establishment which was apparently frequented by some of the more, shall I say, influential and dangerous members of Smoochieville society. I decided to try and find it that night as the sky grew black and the owls tooted and tawooed, or whatever noises they bloody make. All you need to know is that it was dark, and I was risking my life heading out there into the unforgiving mysteries of the night. Before I headed out in my bravest stance and walking style, I stopped by the rather expensive-looking mirror I kept by the door and peered at myself. I didn't look bad at all in my suit and long jacket, but I noticed my nostrils were looking odd. You see, I'd developed this new twitch that I failed to shake off. It was weird, but I just couldn't stop flexing my nostrils, and I feared that it was having a bad effect on my nose. I swore that my nostrils were getting bigger by the day, by the hour in fact, and I was definite that it was down to that flexing technique I had accidentally developed. It was like giving my nose a workout, like a bodybuilder bloke does with those big weights to make his arms all big and massive with veins on them and shit. Those black holes were getting larger by the day, like two cavernous voids of nothing. When I walked towards people in the street, I saw their faces panic as I grew closer, as they became certain they were about to be swallowed up whole by the two massive black canyons that closed in on them. Sure, they would spend the rest of their days weeping, grasping around the dark and howling for escape inside the terrible dread of my two snaffling holes, the tortured, delirious whispers of other trapped souls, their only company. I had to do something about that flexing. It was making me look like an old ape man. From that moment on, seeing a vision of a possible future where all men, women and children will be swallowed up by my oversized orifices, I swore never to flex my nostrils again. And I was true to my word, apart from once, but that didn't count because I had a blue bottle stuck up my nose, and frankly it was the only way to get the bastard out. Anyway, after one last look at my good self in the mirrorino, ensuring the comb-over was all good, I headed out. What would I find out there? Would I manage to gain access to Uncle Rusty's? I was determined to do so. There was one chap I was eager to meet, a shifty, murky character by the name of Burnt Yates. Now, Yates was a tough cookie. No, strike that, he was a tough toffee, because as you know, toffee is harder than dough, and that means he was really tough, like proper rock hard and that. No one knew for sure what he did for a living, but they say he was in construction, loans and all sorts of mysterious shenanigans. My theory? He was a naughty muck tub with ties to the criminal underworld, and I was sure he was the leader of the Brass Spatula Society. But I had to be careful around him, for he had this reputation as a real nipple-biting nutter. He got his nickname because he got burnt once for having a fight with fire. I mean, come on, he actually had a fight with fire? He won as well. And even though he was scarred in the battle, he got off lightly. His cheek was a bit fucked and he had this flappy bit of skin on his hand, but otherwise he was fine. If anything, it only made him look more hard and intimidating. There was a chilling picture of him on the Smoochieville Bugle website, where he was pummelling a teary-eyed reporter into oblivion with a roll of birthday wrapping paper with balloons on it. The journo had jumped out from behind the shelf with a camera to corner him in the pound shop, but his misguided plan had backfired. Looking at that poor man receiving the thrashing of his life, I felt my bowels drop and go all funny. I had to run to the loo immediately just from getting a glimpse of the beast in action, slapping and hurting and flicking his prey with no mercy by the cheap multi-packs of soap and paracetamol. I headed down for Oggy Way, the rougher part of town. The streets smelt of farm shit, and I could hear the guffawing and vomiting of many an unsavoury character. Silhouettes spewed up and downed ale in windows, and through the glass of one building I could see people at it like rabid hogs. I felt a chill down my back. It was then I was accosted by some unpleasant fiend asking me if I wanted to buy some products. "Want any flack top, governor? A little bit of the old fuzzy mop bone," he slimily suggested, lurking around me at knee height, all hunched over and rubby as he spouted out obscure narcotic brands, long yellow fingernails and baggy sleeves like some shit wizard. His hand gestures were strangely hypnotic, like magic tricks with no actual magic or trickery to them. Still, they were very distracting. "I can tell you want some arcade leakage badly, am I right? Or maybe you're more of a wasted lampo kind of guy. I can tell you want something, it's there behind your eyes, lad. Well, I got anything and everything you might want, and all for competitive prices too. Having a sale on my gear this week. Very reasonable, I think you'll agree. You won't find that with any of the other dealers, I'm telling you straight, boyo." No, not for me, love, thank you," I said, squirming and beating his fumbly unwanted hands away from my lovely clothes. "Not tonight, but thanks anyway, old bean." "Parasitic scum," he said, disappearing into the night like a rat lad. It was then I spotted it, Uncle Rusty's. Shit, it looked unwelcoming. For starters, the 7'3" bouncer standing by the door, built like a larger-than-average storage facility, looked at me as if he wanted to stamp on my neck until I was no more. He rubbed his fist as he was getting all ready and prepared to hurt me in my man face. "Sir, what a charming evening it is," I said, sounding like an Elizabethan fop, my voice a bit squeaky, shaky and daft with the nerves. "And may I say what a handsome man you are." "You what?" he barked, veins in his neck pulsating like the ones you find on a throbbing man-rod. "I mean that in a man-on-man kind of way, not like nudie wrestling in the dark. I mean like in the way one chap might admire another chap's general style and attire." I chuckled and watched the doorman preparing himself to deck me into next month. "Anyway, a fine evening it is and all. I came down here and thought, well, why not sample some ales at this fine public house?" There was a silence, and I saw the doorman beginning to calm down. Maybe he wasn't so bad after all, eh? A gentle giant, perhaps. He no longer breathed like an angry bull. "Go on," he said, with a fiendish grin, standing to one side to let me in. I did wonder why he cackled demonically as I entered the pub. That certainly was odd, but I brushed off his disturbing fit of maniacal mocking laughter as the chirpy giggle of a man up on his luck. Perhaps he'd had a good day, I thought to myself, hence the jeering, devilish, howling laughter. I should have known better. The place was dimly lit, a bit seedy, but in a good old-fashioned blokey way, and the scent of fine cigar smoke drifted through the air like a lovely-smelling, slightly flamboyant ghost might mince across the room.
I put on my cool stance and broadened my shoulders up to look more massive and imposing. As I approached the bar at the far end of the pub, I saw shady hard nuts peer up at me from round tables, scarred, lined faces over hustling, quick-handed card games. One guy scowled at me under the slightly cinematic light of a table lamp, and he moved his index finger across the front of his neck speedily with clenched teeth and bulging, angry eyeballs, as if squeezing out a big un. Now, I'm not sure what he meant by that strange gesture, but I thought he might have been admiring my necktie. I smiled and took the compliment on board. Nice fellow, I thought to myself. Not so bad after all, this place. I got to the bar and leaned one arm off it. The barman slithered towards me. "What'll it be?" he asked, awaiting my reply, with hands already on the pumps in anticipation. I clearly looked like a man about town. You could tell by the way he spoke to me, as if I were better than him, more ace than he was. "Sherry, old boy," I said, acting slightly eccentric so the tough guys might think of me as a harmless and charming sort of character. If I acted too hard, they might want to make fightings with me, I thought, so I acted up a bit, playing the camp, carefree dandy. This was my plan to get to the bottom of this case, charm them all into spilling some info on the mysterious, seldom discussed Brass Spatula Society. "Never seen your face in here before, stranger?" the barman said, sounding like a total inbred village cretin. "What brings you down here?" You know," I said, throwing my tie over my shoulder in an attempt to be flash, but instantly realising I'd gone way over the top into a kind of parody of a breezy, happy-go-lucky yet faintly arrogant fop. "I got bored of the same old haunts of Smoochieville. Thought I'd venture on down to Oggy Way for a change. I like the danger of it round here, you know, the fear you're going to be hacked with some sharp implement and mugged for every penny you have. I like the risk. It's exciting. It's a breath of fresh air. Things get too safe and cosy up in the town. Sometimes you just got to take a step into the wild. Live on the edge for a while. Know what I mean?" "Well, you've come to the right place, newbie," the barman said, passing me my sherry. "In fact, you better be careful in here, mister. They'll do you in if you look at them the wrong way." "I'm sure that's not true," I said, giving a playful chuckle and throwing my head back in the air, acting all jocular and hilarious. I turned to the stony-faced drinkers, many of whom stared at me like I embodied everything they despised in the world. My stupid grin instantly disappeared, and I turned back to the barman. "You may have a point, barman. Chin, old boy," I said, before taking a large swig of sherry. This barman was quite a nice bloke, I thought, and maybe if I stayed on his good side, he might be able to give me some inside information, a few clues about this case. I leant in and pressed him for some gossip. "So, barman, is Uncle Rusty the name of the man who runs this establishment?" "Oh no, Uncle Rusty is just a brand name, stranger," he said. "People find the reference to an uncle or indeed an auntie comforting, and seeing the sign Uncle Rusty's makes them think, 'Oh, that sounds nice and cosy, I'm going in.' Think Uncle Ben or even Aunt Bessie at a push. There is no actual Uncle Rusty, but the idea of the man fills the customer with a feeling of general ease." The barman started going on about the brand, marketing, and how to appeal to the average drinker, and to be honest, his babblings really started to get on my wick. I put a stop to his tedious musings. "Yeah, well, that's all very good, and actually very interesting too," I said, forcing out a smile, which was good of me, seeing as I was growing tired of his voice and face by now. "But I want to know who owns the place. Is it by any chance Burnt Yates?" The barman hissed, putting his finger over my lip to hush me up, frankly getting a bit too close for comfort, and if I'm honest, make me feel a bit odd, by intruding into my personal space with his cold, strangely clinical, unwanted digit. Where had that finger been? It smelt of wood and drugs.
Don't go blaring off in here about burnt Yates. They'll cut your tongue out and keep it as a souvenir, and flick it out to show it to their enemies as a warning."
"Really?" I asked in disbelief, looking around in horror and fear. My face must have looked really fucked up.
"Yes," he replied with sharp precision. "That is definitely what they would do to you. So keep your bloody voice down and listen to me. Yes, Burnt Yates owns the place, but you didn't hear it from me."
"Yes, I did," I corrected him bluntly. "You said it just then with your mouth, so I did hear it from you. What are you on about, man?"
"No, I mean, if anyone asks you where you heard it, it wasn't from me."
"Oh, I get you," I said finally, cottoning on. I was acting a bit like a daft lad, I know that, but I think it was because I was actually shitting myself with fear. I could feel the harsh-faced bastards staring into the back of my head, and they were uttering horrid threats, such as, "I'm going to kick him if he doesn't get out of here, and I hate that bloke over there. I want to hurt him badly." I realised then that I needed to get out of that pub. That is, if I valued my life at all, which of course I did, immensely. But it was too late. At that moment a big, huge hand placed itself on my shoulder. That hand was on the end of an arm belonging to a really nasty-looking fellow with a scar all the way down his cheek. Then another hand placed itself on my other shoulder, and that belonged to a similarly rough bloke who glared at me like he despised everything I stood for, every fibre of my being, and as if everything I'd ever said and done in my life had offended him greatly.
"What makes you think you can come round here poking your nose in then, eh?"
the second one asked me.
"Yeah,"
agreed the first chap, not adding much more to the debate. "Fine, sirs, all I desire is a few sherries." I smirked, but as I was so scared, my face just looked weird and slightly creepy, like I wished all three of us were in the gents' room, getting down to it. One of them socked me in the gut real hard, the bounder, and before I could even howl in agony, they both started dragging me off down the pub. Other hard men tried to trip me up as they pulled me along like a broken marionette. Some blokes even gobbed at me. Really horrible behaviour, if you ask me. Then we came to a door and they kicked it open, shoving me in through the opening, where I landed in a pathetic heap on the ground, one tear running from my eye. The pain, oh, the pain. When I finally built up enough strength to raise my head, I saw a familiar face before me. Right there, sat in a comfortable-looking armchair, was none other than Mr. Burnt Yates. In real life, his scars were even more terrifying, and I couldn't help but immediately focus on that flappy bit of his hand.
Boys,
he said, holding up a hand to calm the situation as he puffed on a ciggy.
"Pick him up. That isn't how we treat guests at Uncle Rusty's."
Yates smiled, exuding actual warmth towards me, which was surprising. His two henchmen lifted me up, and Yates pointed to a chair across from him.
"Sit down, by all means,"
he said, grinning from ear to ear. The two hard nuts stood at either side of me as I lowered my wounded body into the leather armchair across from him. It was quite nice, but nowhere near as comfortable as Yates's chair looked to be. It was a psychological thing, I thought, making the visitor's chair much less squishy, a way of ensuring that his prey were less at ease than he was. No doubt a fact that would work to his advantage once firm questioning began.
"So what brings you here then? The ale? The fetching prince of the Yorkshire coast in the barroom? Or was it me you wanted to see?"
I paused for a moment and held my tummy. I mean my stomach, as it was still smarting a wee bit from where that shithouse struck me. "As a matter of fact, Mr. Burnt Yates—"
"Call me Mr. Yates,"
he insisted firmly. "Yeah, Mr. Yates, I wanted to know about—" I paused in hesitation. What was I digging myself into here? My own grave? Or a big, deep pit full of shit and lies? I was soon to find out. "I wish to learn about the Brass Spatula Society." His face dropped like a nana's breast, his eyes suddenly becoming distant, and all the warmth he had previously shown towards me vanished speedily as soon as I finished my misguided sentence.
"And why do you care about the Brass Spatula Society, boy?"
He leaned forward and blew cigarette smoke into my face. It was unpleasant, but I wasn't going to vocalise my displeasure. I think he'd have stubbed it out on my left ball. "Well, do you know Wiggy Wheaton?"
"Course I know Wiggy Wheaton, you total and utter imbecile,"
shouted Yates, his face going all red and puffed up with rage. His outburst was really scary, but I was more drawn to that flappy bit on his hand, wagging and blowing about like a bit of wafer-thin ham.
"Wheaton was a very good friend of mine and a fellow member of the Brass Spatula Society. His death has cut me deeply, boy. An immense void has formed in my heart. Why do you speak of my friend? Why do you want to know about him? What's it got to do with you anyway, you penny-eyed tosspod?"
I felt odd and shuffled in my seat a bit, as if I had a load in my briefs. "Well, I wanted to get to the bottom of his murder," I said, trying to appeal to the crime lord. "And I thought maybe it was something to do with the secret society."
"Well, I run the society, young man,"
he said, sounding like a history teacher telling me about something from olden days that was both really important and also very boring. At that moment he snatched the brass spatula from out of my coat and placed it in his own pocket, as if to say, "I'll take that," which he should have said actually, because it would have been pretty cool.
"And I don't think Wiggy's demise is any of your concern, you strange hermit. There's one thing we don't like around here, it's weird-haired, big-nostril fucknuts like you sneaking around, wanting to know about things that are none of their goddamn business. Boys, eject this tosser from the premises immediately. Good day, sir."
With that, the two bastards pulled me up by my arms like I was a naughty toddler bloke who'd just thrown his own bum waste around the room, smearing it on the floor while laughing insanely. To top it off, Yates viciously threw his cig at me, which hit my tie and set it ablaze. I panicked, whimpered like a poorly otter, and patted out the fire speedily in floods of tears. All the while Yates laughed raucously at my situation with his hands on his hips like a total blackguard. The big fellas gave me a dig each, one in the gut and one in the side, and by Jove it hurt. Before I knew it, they'd thrown me out of the back door into an alleyway. I landed face first in a puddle of piss. Most unfortunate. In retrospect, I feel they were a little harsh towards me, but I certainly learned a lesson. Not to be such a nosy little bastard in the future. Well, I didn't learn anything, actually, for as soon as I stood up and brushed my knees off, I was back on the case of the murder of Wiggy Wheaton. I roamed the streets for the next hour, pondering on this great mystery. But as I reeked of piss, passers-by were staying well clear of me, some of them covering their noses and crossing the street as I came their way, saying things like, "Jesus, this guy stinks of piss," and "Watch out for that scumbag with a pissy odour lingering from him." I didn't care, though. I was too busy thinking of who might have wanted to kill Wheaton. Was it Burnt Yates? Judging by his violent tendencies, it was obviously a possibility, but even if it was him, there was no way I could have gone to the police. They'd have laughed in my face, slapped me round and thrown me to the dogs. Well, they'd actually have thrown me to Burnt Yates and his bastardly gang of thugs, which was much worse, I think you'll agree. Like any man down on his luck and stuck in a dark corner fumbling around for a door, I drifted on down to the Mature Lobster to drown my sorrows, glugging one bottle of Cosmic Dad after the other, somewhat savagely. I had so much booze that night I started to lose count, but the boasting part of me kept a tally in a notepad, so later on I could show off about how many I'd had. The whole night was a haze of darts, manly laughs and blaring sports on the TV set. I also remember flirting with the female bartender. "Hey, Toots," I recall saying, like some 1940s detective working on a complicated prohibition case. This was all in between burps and farts, with my tie all loose and the sweat patches under my pits very much noticeable. "Fancy a game of Subbuteo at my place? You can be Aston Villa if you like. I usually play as them because I like the colour of their kit. It's a vintage edition of Subbuteo, of course, early 90s, but it's still a very fun game. Nothing quite matches some good old-fashioned finger fun, a flicking of the midfielder." "No thanks, Grandad," she said, being a very rude woman if you ask me. She was also incorrect, as I wasn't a grandfather at all. I wasn't even a dad, so the joke was on her. "You don't know what you're missing, woman," I shouted pathetically as she went off to serve some other barroom loser. "Ah, forget you, I don't need you," I assured myself, before returning to the darts tournament I'd set up with the bar regulars, Mr. Hurty, a retired muscle for the mob who used to chin people for a living, the one-armed Chesto Myperito, who had 60 teeth, and Prince Scrote, who claimed to be a former member of the West Mongolian royal family. After feeling triumphant at getting 14 with 3 darts, I passed out in the corner by the fruit machine, crying myself into a haunted sleep, with the sound of the celebratory victory bells when a player hit the jackpot filling my ears. Like the great lads they are, my 3 mates, Chesto, Hurty and Scrote, lifted me all the way back to my home later that night. I was totally out of it, I tell you. I estimated that I must have downed 15 cosmic dads with my wobbling swallower, which is a hell of a lot, I think you'll agree, and if you don't, well, you can sod off then, because I think it is. They put my jammies on for me, all the while receiving hugs from a teary-eyed eye, who told them they were the greatest friends a guy ever had, and that I would leave them all loads of stuff in my will. Then they tucked me up in bed like a sleepy Mr. Mouse, and even made me a nice hot chocolate, God bless those chums of mine. They tippy-toed out as I drifted off to an eventual night's sleep, still muttering things and waxing lyrical about how lovely and great they all were. Of course, in the sober world I had no time for such scum, and wouldn't even entertain the idea of having them anywhere near my home. But drunk, they were the 3 musketeers to my D'Artagnan. The next morning I was awoken by the harsh rays of the sun burning my face through the glass. The first sound I made that morning was a kind of delirious, frightened bark, a truly odd sound, and one I didn't think was humanly possible to actually make. The first thing on my mind, though, was the murder of Wiggy Wheaton. Did Burnt Yates and those sods at the Brass Spatula Society kill him? Or was I barking up the wrong tree? I mean, Yates did look really upset when I mentioned Wheaton, but he might have been bluffing, overcompensating to lead me off into another direction. After I got my clobber on, I decided I would nosy on down to Wiggy's home to visit his wife, Clara. I thought she might have some clues as to what went on. Now, Clara was a retired actress, and in her younger years made some pretty racy movies, I tell you. She played the wife in the sleazy, semi-pornographic Roman epic The Emperor's Sex Wand, with the late and not-so-great Beaky Wilson. And she was also in such notable skin-flick classics as Citizen Lay, Casablanca and Porking in the Rain. I hopped in my trusty old auto and cruised on down to the posh part of town, Lovely Lane, where all the riches lived, those horrible yet lucky bastards. I passed many a garish, brashly painted Art Deco-style pad, outside one of which sat a pompous Hawaiian-shirted toss-chops, drinking exotic cocktails through a straw and sticking twos up at any passing peasant. In this case, that peasant being me. He even shouted out, "I hate you, piece of dirt," as I drove by, and his children pelted me with olives, fine cheeses and pound coins. One went through the open window and twatted me in the eye. "Terrible swines," I cursed, holding up a fist and shaking it vigorously. They mocked and jeered me and found my grandfatherly feeble attempt at rage all the more amusing. Eventually I got to the famous Wheaton headquarters, a big house at the end of the street. There she was, Clara Wheaton, sat on the lawn with what looked like a gin and tonic in her hand. Or it could have been water, but she looked pretty pissed, so it might have been gin. She looked pretty pleased with herself, which was weird in itself. "What the heck?" I said, peering over a privet, which in my view needed a trim. Saying that, seeing as I didn't quite wish to be seen just yet, its overgrown messiness meant it was a big help in the current situation I'd found myself in. She sighed in contentment and reached down to the floor, where she pulled out a book which she began to read while smiling and taking the odd sip of her drink. She didn't look too upset that her husband was dead. I found this most perplexing. I decided to find out what was going on. Approaching her garden, I waved at her. "Clara, great to see you," I said, pretending to know her. It was a good idea, I thought, to act all friendly. As she was pissed, she might have assumed we were friends and let me into the house, therefore letting her guard down and spilling the beans about what she knew. "Who the devil goes there?" she said, shielding the sun from her eyes and staring out at me like a sailor looking for the shore, or something equally pretentious and poetic. "It's Clint Garth, don't you remember me?" I said, reaching her on the grass and holding out my hand for her to shake. She stood to her feet, studying my face and voice thoroughly. She mumbled, eyes squinting. "Don't you remember me, really? We worked on a film together about 10 years ago. Touch It Again, Sam. Bloody good film it was, don't you recall? You said we were soulmates." The last bit was totally over the top, and I immediately wished I had not said it. "Oh, yes, I think I remember you now," she said, attempting to frown but failing due to the ungodly amount of Botox and plastic in her weird, almost androgynous face. "How the hell are you, Mr. "Clint Garth," I chuckled, shaking her hand joyously. She tittered along but looked totally confused and out of it. "How are things, Clara?" "Oh, they're good. Would you like to come inside for a drink?" "I bloody would," I exclaimed. We hugged, and for a moment I feared I was coming across as a stalker. After all, she had been a famous actress once and was surely used to the odd obsessive fan. But as she was slightly inebriated and possibly had a bit of sunstroke too, she was convinced we were old chums. Indoors we strolled, her pouring me a nice glass of dry sherry, and then we sat down in the living room in 2 bamboo chairs. A bit of splintered bamboo stuck in my arse cheek and really hurt, but I bit my lip and continued to play the role of this cool actor bloke. The walls were lined with film posters from her sleazy career. As she sat down opposite me, I noticed the poster above her head for her 1987 film, The Bridge on the River Quim. I found it distracting. "Have you heard about my husband?" "Oh, Wiggy. Walter. Oh, that lovely old fool. How is he?" I said, a wide mouth grinning oafishly. Was I overacting? "He's dead," she dryly replied, no emotion on her face. "Oh. Well, oh dear." I pretended to be fed up, putting my head down and looking at the carpet. "Well, that is very sad indeed. I'm very sorry to hear that, Clara. How did he die?" "Well, between you and me," she looked around, pissed eyes all over the place like marbles thrown in the air by a mad ape. "I killed him. That's right. I killed the bastard with his own wig. Served him right too, the wiggy-haired prick." There was silence. This had been so easy. I didn't even need to press her or anything. She just owned up, the daft drunken cow. "Why would you kill him?" I asked. "Well, he was a terrible man. He'd come home full of coffee, reeking of the stuff. Sugar in it too, just to keep him going throughout the newsday, as he was known for working very hard, with fish and chips on his breath. Then he'd be a right sod to me and call me things like Mrs. Daft Pants and a right silly get, really nasty cutting stuff that you just couldn't forget. In the end, I had enough of him, and I did what any decent woman who gets fed up of being called silly names would do. Killed him and dumped his body in the street. Of course, now with him gone and his life insurance money on the way, I'm free to do as I please. I'm going on a date tonight with a 23-year-old 6'2" porn star. Hung like an ox he is." She put her head back and laughed like a witch, and for a moment I imagined her mixing a cauldron with eyeballs, bits of arse and beavers' faces floating on top of it. "You killed him for the money?" I asked in disbelief. "Well, of course I did, you silly man. What else did you expect from a woman like me?" "Why are you telling me all this shit?" I asked, putting my drink down on the table before me. If I'm honest, I'd lost my taste for it. "Why not?" she smirked, pulling her gun out from within her admittedly super cleavage. "I'm going to kill you." "You're going to kill me because of what I know?" I said, standing up and holding up my hands, backing up to the wall. "Well, I was going to kill you anyway because I don't like your weird hair and big nostrils, but now I'm going to kill you even more because of what you know." She laughed again. "You silly lad." Shaking in fear, I backed right into the wall and thudded into it hard. Just to make the situation more ludicrous, I turned to see my back was pressed against a poster for her 1989 movie, Some Like It Grot. "Please don't kill me, I have a wife and 2 children, I begged, laughably, lying through my teeth and whole mouth in general. "Really?" "Well, no, but I aim to have one day." "Not good enough, I'm afraid, silly hare." With that final cutting insult, which really did hurt my feelings actually, she raised her gun towards me and smirked at the side of her mouth, which was either an evil expression or literally the only way she could smile due to all the plastic in her face. I closed my eyes and got ready to meet my maker, but before I could think about joining the choir invisible, there was a loud bang. I looked down at myself and saw that there was no bullet in me. I glanced across at the horrid harpy to see her standing there with a hole in her head, blood trickling down like jam from a punctured donut. She slumped down to the ground, rather tidily I might add, and lay there in a lifeless heap. Behind her, holding a smoking revolver, was none other than Mr. Burnt Yates. He glared at me with intensity, and his 2 henchmen who had knacked me the night before stood at either side of him, armed with shotguns.
"Well, look who it is,"
Yates tittered.
"Couldn't keep your big oversized nose out, eh?"
He tutted and shook his head. It seemed that somehow, and to the hand of someone, I was going to meet my untimely, gruesome end on this not-so-fine day.
"You got to her before I did, mister,
And for that I got to take my hat off to you." For a moment I stared down the barrel of his gun, fearing a second bullet would be fired any moment and go rocketing into my face. But it didn't happen. With a tiny smile, Yates lowered the gun and placed it in his pocket. He tapped the arms of his henchmen, and they immediately lowered their guns too.
"Get out of here, Guy, we'll clear this up,"
Yates said. Then he pulled out the brass spatula he took from me the night before, the one that had belonged to Wiggy Wheaton, and he dropped it onto Clara's body. Then he looked back up at me.
"I say get out of here, Dick Whisper, before I change my mind and blow your throat out with this fucking gun."
With that I panicked and turned around speedily, diving through the window with no thought or hesitation, glass slicing me up and down my bid-bod. And with that I was gone, leaving Burnt Yates and his cronies to deal with whatever they had to deal with. I returned home and sat for a while in silence, peering out the window and thinking how close I had come to meeting my end. After all that vicious posturing and hard man behaviour, Burnt Yates had spared me and set me free. It seemed that the Brass Spatula Society was a very noble and honourable organisation. If a member of that group met their end, the rest of them were sure to put their heads together, get to the bottom of it, and uphold justice in the old-fashioned vigilante way without police interference. Part of me wished I was a member of the Brass Spatula Society, but that wasn't really on my mind at that point. I was so glad to be alive, cherishing every minute on this earth as the gift it was intended to be. I stood up and walked over to the mirror above the fireplace in my living room and smiled at myself. I realised at that moment that I really liked the man that was looking back at me, and from then on I was going to enjoy life, every second of it, and not let anything trivial get me down. However, it was looking at myself closely in that big mirror when I noticed my face was visibly getting bigger and more exaggerated by the second. I was pretty sure it hadn't looked so big the day before, but there in the living room it looked wider than ever, nose spread out across my face like a squashed toad. My whole face literally wider than it was tall. My chin appeared much larger too, and I thought I looked like a right lantern-jawed bastard. Great. That's what all the ladies are after, I thought. A weird-haired, big-nostrilled loser with an oversized face. The end.